All right, welcome to another edition of Off Topic. My name is Randy Zellea, coming to you from the bowels of New Jersey. I guess the ending of quarantine is upon us. My guest today, former WWE writer. He is an author of the new book. I can't wait to talk wrestling with him. His name is Keith Elliot Greenberg. Keith, how are you, my friend?
Good to see you, Randy.
Thanks for giving me some time tonight. I feel like the wrestling world right now is on an upswing. You know, WWF or excuse me, WWE is doing their normal share of business of being an entertainment company, just not a wrestling company. AEW has sort of lit the wrestling world on fire. I feel that Impact is sort of bouncing back from the treachery that they went through. Ring of Honor is still there, and you have some of these other smaller groups like Evolve and NJPW is starting to make more of a household name here in the United States. I think there's a lot of good wrestling now, and I think it's back on the upswing. Your thoughts?
Well, yes, and by the way, let me give a plug to my book. It's called.
Yes.
it comes out September 1st from ECW Press. It is called Too Sweet: Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution, and it looks at professional wrestling in the year 2020 and how we got here. And the whole motivation for writing the book took place after WrestleMania 34. I was in New Orleans, and the next day, myself and Michael Holmes, who's the executive editor at ECW Press, had a conversation about all the Bullet Club shirts we saw. Now, we were at WrestleMania, so why were we seeing shirts for a Renegade outfit? It was a WWE event. There were WWE signs up all over New Orleans. Yet people, including WWE fans, were wearing Bullet Club shirts, and we concluded we are in a new era. Now, in the recent past, you had the Hulk Hogan era, you had the Attitude era, maybe you had the era, the pipe bomb era after CM Punk, cut that famous promo on Monday Night Raw. But now you have a new era that is not necessarily defined by WWE.
Yeah, and it's funny. You just said some different eras, and you say CM Punk, and I'm a huge CM Punk fan. I thought he was what makes me a fan of any particular wrestler is the ability to be different. If you see the norm over here, and then you see someone who's different making a big boom over here, you just want to sort of pay attention to what's going on because it was, just totally the same over here. Like, I like John Cena. I think what John Cena stands for is a great thing. He's a community guy, loves being out there. I respect the fact that he never made that heel jump because he wanted to stay true to that whole entire thing. But when you have a guy like CM Punk who comes out and just sort of makes that noise, you want to pay attention to that because you don't want to you don't want to lull your audience to bed, because I felt they did that with Hogan through that time where no matter what challenger you threw in front of him, you're like, okay, Hogan, as Bruce Pritchard would say, Hogan must pose. And
now, again, it also depends on how old you were when you were watching that. Yeah. I was already writing for WWF or WWE at that time. So I was looking at it through an adult's eyes. But when I speak to people who were 7 years old at that time,
oh yeah,
they didn't say Hogan must pose. They said Hulkamania is running wild.
I was 7 years old exactly when Hogan slammed Andre, and I look back at the champions, and also let's give people a little bit more of your resume. You worked for WWE till 2007. You were one of the authors for the WWE Encyclopedia. Did a lot of different projects with them, so you are directly familiar with what all the talent and the business model there. They've had some great competitors and some great guys, and some great workers. I think that every era, like the New Generation, the Attitude Era, I think each era there, the Ruthless Aggression Era, each one of them had their standout stars. I just think that when you have a star like Hulk, like Brett, like Shawn, like Steve, like Rock, like John Cena, like Batista, it's hard. And I'll throw Triple H and Undertaker in there. I think Taker and John Cena have been the best examples of the top guys being able to transition from being in the main event back down the card and being able to still contribute without being involved with the belt. Brett wasn't able to do it. Shawn did it when he came back, but Hulk wasn't able to do it. Steve wasn't able to do it because Steve walked out. What's your take on this is just my theory, by the way. I wanted to see what your thoughts on that, because I do think that it's something to being able to contribute after you've already been the guy in that company.
Well, I mean, Brett, as you recall, he also went to WCW when
right.
He left. So it's not as if Brett stuck around. And then Brett went to WCW, which was, from everything I've been told, a pretty disorganized place. Yes. So they weren't able to capitalize on who they had over there. There are some, it's funny. You take a guy like Braun Strowman, who has the championship now. For a while, I was thinking Braun Strowman doesn't need that title because he was such a good character in and of himself. Now, I guess there were a couple of things that may have been done with him, a couple of storylines where maybe his luster as a top guy diminished to a certain extent. But he has the championship now, and I don't know. Do you think that the championship has fortified him, or do you think he's still Braun Strowman, the same Braun Strowman as before?
I think what hurt him was he had momentum going into winning the Money in the Bank. He won the Money in the Bank. Well, first off, I think what hurt him was he was a monster heel. And just like what they did with Cena, sometimes when you have such a hot heel and you put him against a guy who just the fans are a little blah with, like Cena or Roman, I think you have such this 50-50 split, they're going to start going with the heel. I think that's what happened with Bray Wyatt in the original run with Cena. Wyatt was such a good heel against Daniel Bryan. Cena, because Cena had such a mixed crowd, because people were tired of him, it turned Bray babyface without them really wanting to have it. I think the same thing happened with Braun. I think he was such a monster heel. They kept putting him with Roman, and people didn't want to see Roman on TV. They were pushing back against Roman, so they started cheering Braun. So Braun was sort of forced to turn babyface, and I think that he lost a little bit of steam there. But I think when he won the Money in the Bank and he had that whole cash-in thing with Roman and Brock was involved, I think that's where all of his steam and all of his heat died off. Yeah, sorry for the long-winded answer. I apologize.
No, I mean, which is kind of a shame because when we were off camera, we were speaking about there's a plethora of talent in WWE, and maybe because they've stockpiled so much talent, the discerning fan doesn't always appreciate the roster as much as they should.
It's true, and you look at, I think they have some phenomenal talent on that roster, on that WWE roster. I think there is some phenomenal talent they have right now. I do think Kevin Owens is a guy who I will immediately say he can be your next type of attitude era type of star, because he is rebellious. He's different. He can do things that a lot of guys his size probably shouldn't be doing, and he can defy. Yeah, and he could defy himself to authority. He could defy authority. He is great, and they have him as a lukewarm babyface right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Look, I've never been a booker, so I don't like to play. It's like playing Monday morning quarterback. I don't like to do that and say they should be doing this, they should be doing that, since I've never had that job. It's what. But then and look, there's a lot of things I like in WWE and NXT. I watched NXT TakeOver. I thought that Johnny Gargano versus Keith Lee match last week was excellent. A big man versus a small man. I think Gargano is one of the greats. The way he would pull out a foreign object and, make it believable that he could possibly beat a guy with the immense proportions of Keith Lee. I could watch the match recently. It was Kushida versus Drake Maverick versus Jake Atlas on NXT. There was the Timothy Thatcher versus Matt Riddle in the cage match. You know, there's some really, really good stuff on NXT. So I don't want to diminish WWE, but I know that AEW is certainly generating a lot of excitement. And sometimes I say to myself, why during this time of the coronavirus, with arenas not devoid of fans, is AEW consistently making me so excited?
You know what it is? It's the same. I think it's the same reason. And you were with WWE on this. On the next statement I'm making, it's almost like the same reason with when the Monday Night Wars first started. You were so used to having the WWE product, and WWE not sort of giving you this is what you're gonna get and you're gonna take it mentality, but they never had a real competition on a Monday night before. And so all of a sudden you see a lot of the guys that Vince created show up on WCW mixing with some of their homegrown guys. And it's like, oh, okay, here's something different. You're seeing Hogan versus Big Bubba right on their first episode of Nitro, where on the other channel you have Scott Hall on a jobber match. You know, it's would you rather watch him fight an enhancement talent, or would you rather see Hulk Hogan versus Big Bubba, which we saw at WWE throughout the late 80s? So it's the AEW is the new kid in town, and I personally think that if the AEW keeps bringing in not just, I don't want them to see them bring all the former WWE talent in like Impact Wrestling was doing. I like to see them bring the right people in to mix with the right guys that they have in their current locker room. And I think it is going to be something different, and they should be very thankful that AEW is on a Wednesday night, not a Monday night right now.
Right. And it would be interesting. I mean, if they were so foolhardy to go head to head on Monday night, I don't think they'd be faring as well.
No, I don't think so either, because NXT is still a very big unknown. And I think where NXT made a mistake, and Keith, you know the business model more than I would. This is me just, being armchair quarterback. I think what made AEW special was when it was on the WWE network, it was directed towards the wrestling fan, because that's why you have the network. And what made it special was you weren't seeing a lot of the same guys every single week. I don't need to see the Undisputed Era every single week. I'd rather see them once a month and see some vignettes and some promos. So when they are on TV, it's a lot more special. When you see them every single week, it sort of ruined it for me.
Well, it's an interesting you say that, because in some ways Brock Lesnar has played that role on and off.
I love that Brock Lesnar played that role back in 2015. I thought it made it more special when the champion was there, and I thought it made the belt seem very, very important. If the champion's coming around, you want to make sure the belt's on TV. I had a hard time when CM Punk was forced to wrestle every single week with the championship. When John Cena was forced to wrestle every single week with the championship, it sort of diluted the championship. And the more championship belts that you had when they were mixing SmackDown and Raw, it sort of devalued what each championship was worth when everybody was on the same, going back and forth on the same shows.
And once again, I'll qualify this by saying I'm not a booker. I wrote for WWF Magazine. I don't know what it takes to put storylines together, so I don't want to throw stones. I know how I feel as a fan when I watch something, and of course, my interpretation as a fan is going to be a lot different than somebody who's never been exposed to the wrestling business. But at this stage, we all go on the internet, we all listen to podcasts, everyone's watching shows like this. And so everybody can call themselves a semi-educated fan.
And I'll be the first one to say that I am an armchair quarterback, and I'm just going by the years of watching from what I've seen. And like I said, you were in the trenches. You were in the trenches there, with the company, which if you don't mind me asking just some questions from your time there. What was it like during the Attitude Era? Because it seemed like you guys had Raw magazine, you had the regular magazine.
Magazine eventually came out, yeah.
Yeah, so what was that time frame
and
like?
All those guys are my friend, like all those editors, all those writers, Anthony Callie and Aaron Williams, whose real name is Dr. Aaron Feigenbaum. He wrote Shawn Michaels' book, and Barry Werner and Mike Fazioli and Anthony Callie. these guys, like, these are guys I still talk to. Like, we're all friends still. So it was special to be around during that time, to be part of something. I remember, and I told this on some other gimmick I just recently did. I remember being backstage during the Attitude Era and talking to Tim White, the referee, and him saying, look at these like youngsters who just started working for WWE. They're like working in sales or marketing or what have you. And business is just going through the roof. And they think the wrestling business is always going to be this way. But he and I both knew it was a cyclical business. And there would come a time when the bottom would start to fall and things wouldn't be as popular. And people would start to point fingers and people would be laid off. And, that's the way the business has always been. But it was incredibly exciting to be there during that time because everything worked. Not everything, but so much worked. Like, I remember Kurt Angle being a newcomer and knowing he was a great athlete and hearing him cut a promo and thinking, is there anything this guy can't do? And The Rock was already there, and Foley was there, and Austin was there, and Triple H was there. So it's like, it can't get any better.
That was such an amazing time. And again, same thing I sort of feel now with AEW. It was sort of must-see television. And the 2-hour program, you sort of looked up and you're like, oh my God, it's already 9:30. Like it was, and that's the feeling you love to have. I actually, one of my favorite time periods was right before the big cusp of the Attitude Era when you had the Hart Foundation, when you had the stuff where like Austin would beat up the ambulance driver and Brett was in it. That time frame was such an underrated time.
That's like a year there's like a window of about a year there. Because it starts with Austin and Brett in '96 at WrestleMania, where Austin's bleeding and he refuses to submit. And he's in the sharpshooter and he passes out. And suddenly you have this revived Austin, Stone Cold, who had been stunning Steve Austin in WCW, fired via FedEx. Suddenly you see what everybody who knew him knew that he had. And then you had the USA versus Canada rivalry, which was fantastic because Bret Hart's going out there and he's cutting promos on the United States. And he's a Canadian and he believes this. He's talking about healthcare and he's talking about racism. And he's talking about gun control. That is a shoot. And it works because it felt real.
Yeah, and a lot of the guys from that time frame, like Foley, oh my God, Mick does not get the love, and it's a shame that today's fan base does not have more of an idea on how great he was at that time frame, being able to interchange those 3 characters that he was doing. My favorite to me was the SummerSlam match, the cage match he had against Hunter. Because a lot of people forgot that Mick could work.
Yeah.
And he worked with Shawn well in '96. Like it was so compelling. I just felt that he was so underrated for his time.
Yeah, and I remember being backstage a couple of weeks later and just kind of spontaneously getting into a conversation with Triple H about that match. And him, expressing his admiration for Mick Foley and just talking about how they helped each other, and it's good. That's a good match for you to mention because, I think when you look at the annals of both men's careers, that is a match you should stop at.
Yeah, I think Mick Foley legitimized Triple H's title reign at the Royal Rumble 2000. I think that's when people looked at Hunter a lot differently as far as the champion was concerned. And that just there was like that 5-year period, I think, up until the Austin walkout. I thought the WWE was such a I think we all feel the same way that the Invasion could have gone a lot differently. Yeah. I think everyone feels that way, but I just felt that window up until Austin walked out. I thought you had some of the best talent and some of the best stories you had going on. What did the Austin walkout affect? How did that affect the company in that sense, from what you had to do and stuff like
I
that?
wanted to say I never worked in the office. I was always a freelancer who was on retainer.
Okay.
So I was not in the office and dealing with the internal politics there. I knew that people were shocked by what happened. And it's funny, I just finished reading the great book that Jim Ross wrote with Paul O'Neill, who's a great writer and a good guy besides. And Jim Ross talks about what it was like inside the company, because he was the head of talent relations and one of Steve Austin's best friends. And he had to represent the company there. I mean, Austin, you could say what would the term be? He violated the terms of his contract. He just walked out. And, there was tension there. There were some people who were criticizing Steve Austin. And I remember at the time, I think I was talking to Barry Werner, who was the publisher of the magazine. And we both said, hey, man, the guy's going to be back at some stage. So everybody better be careful about what they're saying about Austin, because pretty soon he's going to be standing face to face with you, and you may have to explain those words.
And it's funny you just said that, because I told you before we went on the air that I'm starting to restore some of my old magazine collections, and two of the magazines I got was the one with Austin on the cover with the Y on his T-shirt. And then the other one it was the Stone Cold Truth, where he wrote the article explaining why he walked out. And for me, I always felt that like WWE Magazine and Raw Magazine was like the inside from what you're seeing on the screen. If you're not understanding what's going on there, you're going to understand the magazine from the Raw Magazine standpoint. What was your impressions of when the Raw Magazine came out? What exactly was that? How is it different from the regular magazine?
Hey, you know what? All credit should go to Vince Russo for that. Now, Vince Russo, I know he has a controversial reputation. I say this all the time. I know Vince Russo as a friend, and I think because when he was the editor of the WWF magazine and Raw magazine, we would talk a lot about stuff that did not involve wrestling. So I will always look at him with a warmth that has nothing to do with the wrestling business. But for every storyline he came up with that you hate, Vince Russo did say, let's have Raw magazine be the magazine that pulls the curtain back to a certain extent. Let's feed those fans. The internet was starting. The era of just kayfabing completely is over. And he did see that. And I remember he wrote, and I don't know if it was him, he may have written that under his pseudonym with Vic Venom. And he wrote, I'm going to say the three letters you never thought you'd see here, WCW. And so he was acknowledging the rival company, which WWE never, ever did. They never acknowledged even a rival magazine. When Pro Wrestling Illustrated would try to get a credential, they'd call the office, and Bill Apter, who knew Vince McMahon's father, would be told, oh well, I work for Pro Wrestling Illustrated, and he'd be told literally, there is only one wrestling magazine, the WWF magazine. So that was the attitude. So, Vince Russo decided to shake things up, and that continued until even after Vince Russo was gone. What was interesting was at a certain stage, I think we even pulled the curtain open a little too wide. I remember, after a while, we were acknowledging that The Undertaker was Mark Calloway and that Kane was Glenn Jacobs. And I think a decision was made, like, we can, treat the fans like they're wise to the business, but let's not give the whole magic show away.
Yeah, what's the you don't you can let him on the patio, but you can't let him on the house. You know what I mean? Like that's the phrase I always like to use. Could talk about some of the interviews that you got to do for the magazine. Who are some of your favorite wrestlers that you got to talk with?
Well, I've interviewed so many great wrestlers. I've interviewed so many personalities who I admired. Randy Savage I knew pretty well, and I was good buddies and still am with his brother, the genius Lanny Poffo.
I love him.
I wouldn't say I was close with Andre, but I had numerous conversations with Andre. Bret Hart, I always admired. I always respected his intelligence as well as his wrestling acumen. I remember when Shawn Michaels came back and he had gotten religion, and everybody thought it was a work that, oh, he hasn't found God. And lo and behold, he was a much different kind of guy. He was a much more reasonable kind of guy, and a guy who literally had a second career after back injuries, retired him. So, there were moments there. I used to spend a lot of time talking to Mick Foley. I remember going to Iraq on one of those tours and spending a lot of time with Mick Foley and discussing the validity of whether we should be engaged in the war in Iraq. Are there really weapons of mass destruction here? Of course, we had nothing but admiration for the servicemen and women, but asking questions like, were they being exploited or taken advantage of? Some of them were very idealistic. They felt they were going to bring democracy to Iraq, and that would spread around the Middle East. And we had nice talks about that, and that was a period where America was pretty politically polarized, and it wasn't the kind of conversation you'd have necessarily in front of anybody. So there were a lot of people I got to meet and know, and then there were also all the legends who were around when I was coming up. When I wrote Classy Freddie Blassie's book, I interviewed Freddie Blassie. I interviewed John Tolis. I interviewed the Fabulous Moolah. I interviewed Killer Kowalski and Arnold Stolen and Dick Steinborn, who just recently passed away. All of these people are gone now. So I was fortunate to capture these conversations before all these people went away, because those stories will never be repeated. And here's an interesting thing. When I was co-authoring Ric Flair's book, Jerry Briscoe suggested I call Jim Barnett, who was the legendary promoter in both Atlanta and Australia, and was a real behind-the-scenes kingmaker in the NWA, and a very important, powerful role in WWF as well. And he said, you should call Jim Barnett. And Jim Barnett was ill at the time. And I got Jim Barnett on the phone, and he answered, and I thought, now all these top secret stories will finally come out. And he 100% kayfabed me and gave me nothing.
What do you think about now these podcasts that are out? I know there's a lot of good wrestling podcasts. There's a lot of ones that are decent. Like, I know me, I like listening to Bruce Pritchard. I like listening.
Bruce Pritchard is an insider.
Yeah, it's like I like Bruce. I like Eric Bischoff's. I like Jericho's. Is there any particular?
I like Busted Open. Yeah,
Dave and I. Dave and I found ourselves at the XFL game, sitting right next to each other, and we were talking. Dave looks at me, and goes, "I was here the first time around." And I said, "Yeah." I said, "It's certainly interesting. It's a shame that the XFL didn't make it around this year."
What was it like being at the XFL? I was at the XFL the first time around too. What was it like being at the XFL the second time around?
I said at this point in time, the way they have everything being run, it deserves the opportunity. The access that they were giving, not only for the fans but for the media as well. They're letting us walk around the field. They're giving us a lot of access to the players. And I thought the way they were presenting the product was good. I think it was, if you're trying to compare it to the NFL, it's not a polished product, but it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be an alternative. And I thought it would have done well, but the pandemic really just I just think the New York, New Jersey team should not be at MetLife Stadium. I think it's because it's an 80,000 seat stadium.
Yeah, I actually thought, on Randall's Island, I know it's hard to get to. You can't really get there by mass transportation. What's that, Icon Stadium? Well, what's that stadium in Harris, New Jersey?
Oh, Red Bull Stadium.
Which is such a great stadium.
Perfect.
And that's a stadium they probably would have filled up.
Yeah, they told me that their goal was to fill up the downstairs of MetLife. And I said, that's just a little too greedy because other teams were using soccer stadiums. And if they would have done that, it would have looked a lot more full on TV. But when you're watching it, you're sitting there going, oh, why do I want to do that? And there's nobody there.
Yeah. And I don't know what the seating capacity is for the Red Bull Stadium, but I would think they could come pretty close to selling it out with the XFL.
Yeah, I think they would have sold out because the Guardian fans were really into it, and I still talk with some people from the Guardians now, and I know when everything, the mass layoffs, I made sure I gave my blessing to them and just say, you guys were great, very professional. You couldn't ask for anything more for what the staff was trying to do. It's.
And I remember, watching the XFL this time around, like the first couple of weeks, and saying, not bad. I'm enjoying this.
Yeah.
The NFL was over for the season, and I was pretty entertained.
It was like I said, if you're looking for clean, if these guys had the talent, they'd be in the NFL. Mm-hmm. But there are diamonds in the rough there, which ended up getting signed. I think they said during the NFL offseason this year, I think they said 25 XFL players got signed.
Yeah, which is great. Yeah.
So it served its purpose. It's almost like a feeding ground to the NFL. So we were talking before. Let's get off the WWE product for a minute. We were talking about how the indie circuit right before we went on air on how this is a great time for wrestling. What's your take on some of the other organizations like AEW, like Impact Wrestling, like Ring of Honor? What are your takes?
Well, and my new book discusses all of this, and I go through the history of these different organizations. One promotion. Have you ever checked out GCW yet? Game Changer Wrestling, their Jersey group.
I have not seen them yet. No.
But they do this show. They do the Joey Janela spring break shows. I've seen their shows on the East Coast and on the West Coast, and there's a certain edge to that. That's Attitude Era times 1,000. Joey Janela's spring break last year was the midnight show that took place after the New Japan Ring of Honor show. Who did you have in there? You had Necro Butcher, who looked like he was like 65 years old, but fighting and bleeding. You had Tracy Smothers in his singlet with the Confederate flag on it, thinking he's still a baby face. You had Dustin Thomas, the wrestler with no legs. You had a guy from Montreal called Sexy Eddie. At one point, he was in a towel. He gets the towel ripped off. He's naked and he's holding his balls, and he does a moonsault from the top rope. So that is a different product and a very enjoyable product. I just spoke to a guy in San Diego who calls himself Dirty Ron McDonald. He had a drive-in wrestling match, during the coronavirus. And it was all
very cool.
Secretive. You had to text and you'd get a number and you'd get a location. And, Ring of Honor, they always have high quality talent. They have international agreements with New Japan and CMLL and Revolution Pro. And, they're a great alternative wrestling league. And I'm curious to see if having Marty Scurll as the co-booker has an impact. Maybe, they will at some point do some arrangement with AEW. Who knows? And in addition to the book I just wrote, Too Sweet Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution, I am actually doing a follow-up book about wrestling during the time, wrestling during the time of the coronavirus, basically. Initially, it was supposed to be, 2020 was supposed to be the greatest year in professional wrestling because you had WWE and NXT and AEW and New Japan and Revolution Pro and Progress and AAA and CMLL, and then the coronavirus hit. And so with all of this stuff that's going on, now it's a very different story. And there's a lot there. And a lot of the story is how these wrestling leagues have been functioning during this pandemic. There's stories like the story of the drive-in wrestling show. And then there's going to be the story of the recovery as we come out of this and how those wrestling leagues will be transformed. And in the midst of this, you have AEW putting on events like the Stadium Stampede, which is something people will be talking about 10 years from now, coronavirus or not.
I personally loved the AEW show, how they were able to still put Double or Nothing together. I thought the introduction to Brian Cage was good. I think
it was wonderful. Yeah.
I think having Taz be a mouthpiece, you can't ask for a better mouthpiece than a guy who's for was it the last 10 years has had a radio show here in New York.
Right.
So he can talk and he understands the business. He knows how to get people over. You have Moxley, who's who. It's a shame WWE was not able to hit the mark with him the way they really wanted to.
You had Moxley and Brody Lee, who was Luke Harper, and I thought they had a really compelling match, and I loved the finish with the sleeper hold.
I enjoyed that. One of my best buddies, and if you ever come down to the Jersey area, I recommend, if you're a game guy, to go Level 1 Games in Pompton Plains. I always mention him every single show. I had to make sure I get the plug in now. And he is waiting for that Hangman Page turn. He is waiting, and we are getting. I think we would have had it already if we wouldn't have had the coronavirus. But he is.
Well, you know what? I'm enjoying it being spread out during a long period of time, and at Double or Nothing, seeing Kenny Omega and Hangman Page work together during that Stadium Stampede, that moment where they're both in the bar. I was thinking like, hey, I'm not ready for the turn yet. Maybe, let me get lulled into thinking he's never going to turn. And who knows, maybe he won't be the one who turns. Maybe it'll be Omega who turns. So that's what wrestling is supposed to be.
Exactly.
You wildly speculate, and you're surprised when you receive your answer. You don't call it in advance.
And one guy who I'm going to tell you, who it's a little late for him to get the big boom. It's funny I say boom too, but there's a guy out there who helped revolutionize the wrestling podcast, and Colt Cabana, who I think Colt Cabana has been a great addition to AEW, mostly because I think there's a lot of things he can do behind the scenes to help them. I like that you're seeing a lot of these familiar names from the outside circuit who were never really made to WWE come over here.
Joey Janela. What?
Joey Janela, Sammy Guevara, who's we're all really big fan of
Such
Sammy.
A talented guy.
Yeah, and Darby Allin, who I'm just hoping he doesn't hurt himself. That's all.
So interesting because I was just going over photos for the book because the book's coming out, end of the summer, and we have this photographer who I met at a PWG show, Pro Wrestling Guerrilla show, Excalibur's promotion out in LA. This guy, Kevin Q, he calls himself. And we were just looking at photos to put in the book. And there's some incredible stuff of Darby Allin doing, the coffin drop off of a balcony at one point. I remember seeing him at an indie show when I was researching the book, and him doing that move off the top rope with his skateboard, and thinking this guy deserves international attention, and now he has it.
What's funny with that too, I felt that his match against Cody at Fyter Fest last year put him on the map.
Yeah.
And that's one thing you could say about Cody, because same thing with Sammy, because when their first show on TNT, that first match with Sammy versus Cody, like, you have to give the guys from the Elite credit, because the first 6 months of AEW, or 5 months, the first few months of the show, I'm not going to put a time frame on it, but they're willing to put other guys over to help get them established, instead of it just being the Elite show. Because when the NWO was going in WCW, those guys were all going over, and younger talent never had a chance to develop.
Right, everybody jobbing to them.
Yeah, so Cody and those guys are doing a good job and know what they're doing. And
look, at what was the show in January? Before, or was it February?
Oh, Revolution.
Here, MJF had his hand raised at the end.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like, okay, MJF is being an irritant, and now it's time to bury him.
Yeah. Yeah, it's and not only that, but they planted the seed enough where they can go back to it too. And that's the great part about storytelling. And then there's Impact. Impact at one point I thought was going to be the boom that's going to be the competition for the WWE. And you can point the fingers on why it didn't work out. You can say it was when Hogan got there, it was Dixie Carter's fault, it was this and that. But I felt they were right there, and then all of a sudden the bubble popped on them, and now they're sort of in a rebuilding period. What have you saw from what they're doing right now? Some of the good and some of the things that need improvement.
Well, it's interesting because what was I reading today? With all that WWE talent that's been released, there is a role for some of those folks, and not necessarily reprising their WWE characters. Let's take a guy like Zack Ryder. I mean, we don't know where he's going to end up, but let's not call him Zack Ryder or some variation of Zack Ryder. Let him just go there and work, and let him use his personality. I think there's a lot of potential there. And who knows what their working relationship is going to be with all these other indie promotions that are out there, and these Japanese promotions, and these Mexican promotions, and these British promotions. So, Angelina Love says this in the book I just wrote. She says the thing about Impact is that they always have the talent, and they always get an 11th hour reprieve.
Yeah. No, that's fair. That's very fair. If it's okay with you, if you don't mind, can we also do a little name association? You can give your opinion about. Since you started with WWE when it was back WWF back in that later point, we'll throw a tag team out there, the Hart Foundation.
The Hart Foundation. One word name association.
No. You can give just a
Hart Foundation. To me, that they were what a tag team should be. You had stout, muscular Jim the Anvil Neidhart, the Anvil, and then you had the Hitman, the excellence of execution, scientific and rough and rugged. And I think that's the right combination.
We'll stick with tag teams. We'll go Demolition.
Demolition. They were supposed to be reprised. They were supposed to be a Road Warriors knockoff, and instead they became legends all their own, to the point that the Road Warriors actually got booed against them when they finally were acquired by WWE.
It's funny too. I always thought the Powers of Pain were more of an LOD ripoff, with the way that
I think they were, but Demolition worked better.
Yeah.
I sometimes wonder, because who was it? Randy Cully was one of the Moondogs, was one of the original Demolition guys.
Yes.
I think it was that combination though of Bill Eadie and Barry Darsow that really made them compelling.
and then adding Brian Adams as the third.
Crush, yeah.
I always like this one. Hacksaw Jim Duggan.
Hacksaw Jim Duggan. I think I remember seeing him in the Florida territory. He was a solid kick-ass wrestler. He was a real athlete. He was a college athlete, and he was a brawler, and he was believable. He played a character, the flag waving, standing tall, kind of all American, and it was an era of characters, and I think he did a pretty good job at it.
He had made a comment because of where his spot was on the card. Oh, he was always the babyface to get the Hogan for the hot heel. He said sometimes it's good to be the drummer or the bass player in the band instead of the lead singer. Right. So I guess that's the right attitude I had. Ravishing Rick Rude.
Ravishing Rick Rude. You look at a guy like Sammy Guevara now, and his predecessor is Ravishing Rick Rude. Ravishing Rick Rude was original. Playing the arrogant, smug ladies' man. At that point, I don't think you had show writers who were telling these guys necessarily what to wear to the ring and what to say during their interviews. And Ravishing Rick Rude, all that wiggling and the facial expressions, and his highly pronounced abs and the various slogans and imagery he put on his trunks. He was a guy that every week made you curious to see what he was going to do.
And I felt he became more of a badass after he cut his hair. I never
thought about that.
Mr. Perfect, Kurt Hennig.
Again, Mr. Perfect was a blue chipper, to use Jim Ross's terminology. He was, second generation wrestler. He came from that part of Minnesota where everybody was a monster. He came up with the Road Warriors. Barry Darsow was part of that crew. He was a legitimate guy. Later on, Brock Lesnar. He was, a legitimate athlete, and he had a great personality too. He was very, very funny. And it was his facial expressions, the way he'd chew his gum, the way words would leave his lips, the way he, raise an eyebrow. There was, when you look at a guy like MJF now, who has all these little subtleties in his heel presentation, a lot of that I saw in Kurt Hennig.
This one's always near and dear to my heart. The Ultimate Warrior.
Well, what can I say? The Ultimate Warrior, he had the most belligerent body I'd ever seen at the time. He very much did not seem like a human being when you were watching him from the stands. And even backstage, it was hard to see him as just a regular guy. He was always kind of jacked up, and not always. I would approach him periodically, and he was always very polite, but I hesitated before I did.
All right, this is always a fun one because you said you were really good with him. The Macho Man Randy Savage.
Macho Man Randy Savage is a guy, a one in a generation guy, and there was recently an interview with his brother, and I was surprised his brother never told me that this story. I think I'd read it was a print interview that when Randy Savage took his gimmick, his interview style from the late Pampero Firpo, who would end his interviews with "Oh yeah," and a very gravelly voice. And Lanny Poffo told a reporter recently that once Randy developed that gimmick, Lanny never heard his brother's real voice again.
I was very surprised to hear that he would negotiate. He was in negotiation to try and come back in 96, 97. I was very I was really disappointed that one didn't work out. I really would have loved to see it.
I didn't know about that. I was never given the inside line on that.
Yeah.
because the Randy Savage in WCW was not the Randy Savage that we saw. And then there was the other Randy Savage who worked for his parents' promotion in Kentucky, and then when invaded the Memphis territory and had that wild feud with Jerry Lawler. And that was a pretty intense Randy Savage.
This is a fun name because of on how great he was. Well, not how great he was, but he definitely made an impact. Yokozuna.
Yokozuna, it's an interesting one. First, when Yokozuna first came in, I thought he was a gimmick, just like a 600-pounder who would squash people. And he had the pedigree. He came from that proud Samoan wrestling family, and he could work, and he could tell a story. And sometimes his girth was secondary because you thought of him as a wrestler first. A great tag team with Owen Hart also. We spoke about the Hart Foundation before. Here you had a big guy and a high flyer. To me, perfect complements of each other.
Yeah, and we all love Owen, and I actually was almost in tears when I was watching The Dark Side of the Ring when going back over that whole situation. It's very, 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 very sad to this day to think about it. Nature Boy Ric Flair.
Well, Nature Boy Ric Flair, having co-authored his book, he really was Ric Flair. He lived that life, and he savored the benefits of being the Nature Boy, and he suffered for always playing the high-flying, wheel-and-dealing, limo-riding son of a gun. And he owned that, and he was hard on himself. He was his own worst critic for some of that. But he was, you never saw a bad Ric Flair match. And when I watched Ric Flair wrestle, there was a joy that he brought to the people, even the people booing him. Even when he would heckle people individually, they were exuberant by it. When he would not sign an autograph, he would still manage to make somebody feel like they had a moment with the Nature Boy. He'd point at the guy's girlfriend and say, now, if you had her ask me, I would have signed it. And the guy would go, wow, Ric Flair, he's the best.
I feel because we're getting into softball season, it's appropriate to mention his name. What about Sid? Sorry, I had to.
I think that the expectations for Sid were always higher than they were. At the same time, we're still talking about him. And we still remember matches he had. And we remember all the Sid stories. And we know about the backstage altercations. And we're talking about softball season. So we're still thinking about Sid more than we're thinking about, say, Mantar.
Yeah, well, that's true too. How about Vader?
Vader, when I've spoken with Japanese fans about Vader, he had this whole mythical persona in Japan that I don't think we fully appreciated. Although, he was WCW champion. He did that angle where he attacked Gorilla Monsoon when Gorilla Monsoon was the figurehead president of the WWF. That really felt like a shoot. I believe he was a legitimate tough guy. And when you watched his matches, you got the feeling that he wasn't holding back from his opponents.
We'll do a few more, and I'm going to ask some indie ones as well, or AEW guys, because who you spoke with about your book. We'll do the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels.
A man of multiple careers, a man of who led numerous lives, technically one of the greats, and in terms of having heart, he'd rank near the top.
You said you had some conversations with Andre the Giant.
Yes, Andre the Giant, aside from being a legend, there as the book, and I just read the book if you haven't read it, by Bertrand and Pat, who are, who've done other books as a team. There was a sadness to Andre the Giant when I knew him. There was a loneliness. He knew that he was not going to live long. And it was hard to be a giant with everybody gawking at you. I mean, the book tells the story a lot better than I can. So there was he was an attraction, but there was a burden that came with being that kind of an attraction.
Hulk Hogan.
Hulk Hogan, again, you can look at wrestling in the 1980s and characterize it as the Hulk Hogan era. One performer being the face and name of an era.
D-Generation X.
D-Generation X, I guess they helped usher in the Attitude Era. Now, a lot of that came from what was going on in Philadelphia at ECW, but that was Shawn Michaels before he became a gentleman, so to speak. And that arrogance actually helped change wrestling. They also were both incredibly, well, not just Shawn and Triple H, but, let's throw in China, let's throw in the Road Dogg. They were, an incredibly talented group of characters.
Sean Waltman, 1, 2, 3 Kid, and X-Pac.
At his core, a great athlete, someone who was a true wrestling fan and wanted to, that was the way he expressed himself. And I think regardless of his age or the persona that he was playing, you always saw how much he loved giving in that ring. And in the book that I just completed, Too Sweet Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution, Mike Quackenbush, the owner of the Chikara promotion, talks about getting Sean Waltman to come back, shave, and perform again as the 1, 2, 3 Kid, and what a thrill that was.
Sean has certainly changed his life around to be such a very positive person in this business. Talk about another two guys who changed their act around: Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, the Outsiders, Razor Ramon and Diesel.
Well, that's interesting too, because they were Razor Ramon and Diesel, and those were two WWE manufactured characters. And those were two guys who went to WCW, and they just highlighted their own personalities, flaws and all. And, when we talk about WWF's Attitude Era, it was countered by those two guys in the in WCW, kind of forcing WWF to push it even further.
Some of the indie guys that we were discussing before, Orange Cassidy, one of our favorites. Can you talk to me about him? Like I said, I pop every single time I see him on TV every single week. I always yell, "There's my boy!"
Also, what a great athlete! Like, imagine doing all of that stuff with your hands in your pockets. But when I was working on the book, I must have run into Orange Cassidy 8 or 9 times all over the United States, and I'd say, "I really want to interview you. I really want to interview you." And on the record, he would never come out of character. Now off the record, you can guess that, he might have let his guard down. But I was never able to interview the man behind Orange Cassidy.
Some of the great young talent that AEW has, the proud and powerful.
Those guys are great. They were in. They were an Impact.
Yeah, they were an Impact for a while, and what? Underutilized.
Yes, underutilized. And I and those guys also, they seem so happy to be there. They seemed so overjoyed just to be part of something. This was something they dreamed about doing. You know, I mentioned GCW, Game Changer Wrestling, before, and their show, the Joey Janela's Spring Break show last WrestleMania. And those guys were on the card against the Midnight Express. And afterwards, they spoke about how here they were, these two Puerto Rican guys growing up in New York, idolizing the Midnight Express, and what a thrill it was, and how unfathomable it was that all those years later, they'd share a ring with them. It was actually, maybe they were working me, but it felt pretty touching.
And the funny thing is, right now, the way they come off on TV, even though they're heels, they really look like they're having too much fun. You almost want to root for them as baby faces in that sense.
Right, because they're fun. Yeah.
They're definitely fun. A couple other guys from AEW, I'll just throw names out there. I also am a huge fan of the Lucha Brothers.
Yeah, I mean, what can you say? Those guys, now they were in Lucha Underground. Yeah. And from what I understand when I was researching this book, it was really the AAW promotion in Chicago was doing lucha style shows. And that's where they started to develop a following of people who weren't necessarily lucha fans, but appreciated what those two guys brought to the ring.
I feel like I could do this with hours for hours with you, but I will say this because I don't want to leave out the ladies who've done a great job in all the promotions. I feel like for AEW that their women's roster and their women's wrestling, it needs to catch up a little bit more.
Yes. I mean, you know, the WWE definitely has the edge when it comes to women. I think
AEW's tag team division blows away WWE's, and I think that AEW right now, for only having one show and the internet show for Dark, I think they're putting out a tremendous product. And I think WWE, once maybe they get fans back again, you're familiar with a lot of people over there. There's too much talent for them not to right the ship. Mm-hmm. I think that's the best way of saying it. So the new book is called Too Sweet, Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution. Keith Elliot Greenberg is with us here. Keith, I like I said, I could do this for another hour, but I thank you so much for coming on. Maybe we'll have a part 2, and then we're gonna get a copy of the book and we're gonna review it on the site. And so
the book will be out. You know, the official date is September 1st. I'll probably be out a few weeks beforehand. I'm happy to come back, and to everybody else, go to Amazon and order it. Bombard ECW Press with pre-orders. Maybe I'll get some royalty checks before the book even comes.
I hope so too. Keith, just hang on one second. I'd like to thank everybody. You can also follow us backsportspage.com, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all at Backsportspage. Follow me at Randy BSP on Instagram and Twitter. I'll be back tomorrow. I have Chris Canty from ESPN Radio 98.7. We're going to discuss the Giants a little bit more. Otherwise, for Keith Elliot Greenberg, I'm Randy Zellea. Thanks for listening and watching Off Topic.